Good afternoon. Welcome to Global Media Industry Speaker Series. I'm Wenhong Chen. I'm an associate professor in the School of Journalism and Media. And together with Dr. Alisa Perrin, I'm also co-director for the Center for Entertainment and Media Industries. Before we start, and kickstart our spring semester GME series, I'd like to thank the Graduate School, the Department of Radio, TV, and Film, as well as the School of Journalism and Media for their financial support. I also want to thank our friends at the Center for East Asian Studies, as well as Center for Asian American Studies for their help for promoting our events. And of course, without the support from our student co-organizer, Maria Scaras, as well as Josh Xiao, I could not get anything done. And a big thanks to them for their support. And our speaker today is Dr. Mallapragada. Dr. Mallapragada is an associate professor in the Department of Radio, TV, and Film, College of Communication at the University of Texas at Austin. And she is also a faculty affiliate at the Center for Asian American Studies, South Asia Institute, and the Department of Asian Studies. Dr. Mallapragada's research and teaching is at the intersection of cultural studies of media, Asian American media studies, online media and transnational cultures, media industries, and immigration, race, ethnicity in media. Her first book, Virtual Homelands, Indian Immigrants and Online Cultures in the United States, examines the role and politics of the web in recasting notions of Indian American identity and cultural citizenship since the late 1990s. Right now, Dr. Mallapragada is working on her second book titled Race and Ethnicity in US Media Industries that focuses on race, diversity, and multiculturalism in the context of US media industries since the 1990s. Dr. Mallapragada has published work in the Journal of Cinema and Media Studies, Communication, Culture and Critique, Television and New Media and Society, South Asian Popular Culture, and edited anthologies such as Craft of Criticism, Critical Media Studies in Practice, and Global Asian American Popular Culture, and the Sage Handbook of Web Histories. Now, I will give a round of welcome to Mary and give the floor to her.
Thank you. Thank you so much for inviting me to be a part of the Global Media Industry Speaker Series. I especially want to thank Dr. Wenhong Chen for her invitation and Maria Scaras for working with me in organizing it. And of course, I didn't realize Josh, who's apparently the boss of this entire enterprise, but just like a real boss, he was behind the scenes. So thank you. And I quickly, and of course, the Center for Entertainment and Media Industries. I also want to thank, I see a lot of my former students in the participants here and former colleagues as well. So I just want to, not former colleagues, and I want to appreciate and thank them for being here. I also feel I want to say this in the iconic words of a Texas lawyer: I am live here and I'm not a cat. Okay, now before I get into the presentation, I just want to clarify that my presentation is using the word diversity, and certainly that word can be used to imply many different kinds of things, but I'm using diversity in the context of racial diversity. And arguably, one could say that in the media industries today, that is the way in which this term is really being mobilized. And we can talk more about the implications of all of that later on. So very quickly, for those of you who are, not acquainted with my work, my previous work, this presentation is building up on my previous work, which was about nation, race, media, and digital networks. And so my first book, Virtual Homelands, is really about digital transnational networks, but it was really engaging with migration and the confluence of gender, race, and national identity in the way in which online communities are formed. And building on that, my current work is actually interested in South Asian Americans. And while I think about South Asian Americans as a broader kind of analytical concept, you will see through my own examples and some of the comments I will make that Indian Americans tend to be the kind of hegemonic group within South Asian Americans. There are many historical reasons for it, but more importantly, in the context of the industries that I'm talking about, it's interesting to remind ourselves about how Indian Americans occupy a certain role within South Asian Americans, yet it is important to use the word South Asian Americans because that term gets mobilized more broadly in the industry. So I'm just making that claim so as to, let you know that I am not necessarily erasing the difference within South Asian Americans. I'm still trying to work out how to be able to talk about both of them because both are being operationalized in the industrial landscape. And so my current work is about multiculturalism, and I'm looking at issues of representation, cultural citizenship, and the marking of difference and the production of. So I'm looking at how we can bring theorizations about race and racial difference and all the kind of attendant issues around it to thinking about the industry. And so my sites of analysis are media texts, cultural discourses, and of course, the media industries itself, the institutional logic, the institutional narratives and discourses, and reception, especially through social media. I have not yet done any ethnography, but I've been looking at kind of audience reactions or audience narratives and experiences through social media. Now, as I mentioned in the abstract for my talk, the discourse of multiculturalism as the new mainstream, it's been evolving for a couple of decades now. And it is being very strategically adopted by the industry, especially consumer and media industries, to reframe the cultural, financial, and essentially ideological investments. And it is a way to appeal to what the consumer industry and the marketplace imagines is the new terrain, is the new market for them. So the images that you see here on this slide are really kind of tapping into the kind of evolving discourses that tie this notion of multiculturalism to shifts in kind of demographic changes, but also turn this discussion about multiculturalism to a sense of we have saturated the existing market, we need to look for new markets. So there is a very interesting kind of confluence of discussions about race and cultural difference with that of markets and consumer appeal. And so it's really kind of produced around, as you see in these images, around the sense that there is a tipping point, the multicultural is the culture. And so there's a lot of reporting, statistical analysis, and big data produced around who this multicultural consumer is. Now, specifically, I'm interested in South Asian Americans. And as you can see through these kind of images here, there's this whole notion of diversity being good for business. Give me 1 second, sorry. Diversity being good for business and kind of producing a lot of information about South Asian Americans and targeting them. And it's about making them visible, but also, as I will hope to discuss in a few minutes, it is also kind of producing Asian Americans as premium consumers. And so this is a kind of a red flag for those of us who study Asian Americans in a kind of historical sense, because we need to ask whether it is a reformulation and a reframing of the model minority stereotype, albeit in kind of very racially capitalist ways. So Asian Americans are model minorities because they spend a lot of money, they're extremely, wealthy. These are all kind of constructs. And as the Nielsen's report from 2013 here suggests, they're sophisticated, significant, and savvy. I also want to quickly note that this Nielsen's report from 2013 was the first time that Nielsen's actually did a comprehensive survey of the consumer habits of Asian Americans. And again, for those of us who study Asian American history, this is an interesting way in which we can think about policy documents or consumer reports kind of producing race, because this is a kind of production of the Asian American consumer or the Asian American community as suddenly kind of arriving into the marketplace, where we know that Asian American communities have been here for centuries, and Asian American communities have been buying things for centuries. So it's an interesting way to think about how some of the conversations that have become very default conversations in the way in which we track industry shifts have deep kind of cultural roots in legacies of racism, whiteness, kind of an imagination around the nation in terms of a monoracial identity, and a kind of very kind of strategic way in which difference is co-opted to think about kind of a reimagining of the nation, but in a kind of global marketplace. Oops. Right. Another aspect of this kind of discussion about multiculturalism, of course, is that a lot of these connections are tied to the notion of diversity. So in other words, if multicultural mainstream is the big construct, we see that there is a strategic way in which that notion gets kind of distilled into narratives, rhetoric, practices, and policies that have to do with diversity. So here in this slide, the images that I have here and the information here is essentially highlighting that diversity is predominantly understood in the industry and in kind of discussions about the industry. So here I'm implicating, in many senses, the academic world too, in the way in which we think about the question of diversity. Are, for example, South Asian Americans being represented? So we have never have I ever. So that is a good thing. So we have more brown bodies here. We have more celebrities, as you can see in the right side image. We see diversity and think of it in terms of numerical representation, but also representation in terms of, they're standing in for the community. So Mindy Kaling becomes a representative of the larger community. So she often has to deal with the burden of representation. She tries to shove it off and say, I don't care about it. But we know that when these communities are underrepresented, there is a heavy burden of representation on them. There is also a kind of tension between wanting to represent, but also representing that which has a return on investment. So diversity, again, as being good for business. We also see that, not just in the summer of 2020, when there has been a broader kind of racial reckoning, but even before that, there has been a kind of diversity reckoning in the industry. So we have seen for the past 10, 12 years, a lot of discussions in the industry about lack of diversity. So this image about SNL is, saying that when Leslie Jones left SNL, there were headlines which said SNL once again has to grapple with its diversity problem. So there's a much more explicit way in which diversity is being linked to whether the industry is being relevant or not, or it's not. Yet, I want to problematize this, but this is the dominant way in which it's discussed. And of course, you have an abundant amount of information, again, statistical analysis, but also kind of qualitative interpretations of data that essentially kind of help us understand why we need to track diversity numbers, why we need to understand how diversity is not just at the bottom or at the top, but we need to look at people in front of the camera, behind the camera, across all levels, who are the staff, who are the food caterers. I mean, just looking at the industry broadly and looking at where inclusion is happening across the spectrum. And this is all necessary work, but I think at the end of the day, it still becomes a very limiting framework, and there are kind of broader kind of paradigmatic shifts that need to take place. And in some senses, I want to argue that these questions still are pretty much in the matrix. We have to get outside the matrix to even think about why we ask only these questions and not other questions. And I wanted to, of course, quickly point you to the headline in the middle. And this happened in 2015 when the fall of 2014 was seen as a very significant year for television, where a lot of shows premiered, and a lot of them were about Asian Americans or had Asian American casts. And of course, and broadly people of color. So there was this unfortunate headline in Deadline, which has since been deleted, and the headline has been recast as something else, where the reporter essentially is asking, is it too much of a good thing? And there have been other discussions we see online in reports and in serious, thoughtful kind of serious, not thoughtful, but serious investigations into whether we need to police diversity, whether it can be too much of a good thing too soon. And so again, we see the X-nominated audience here is, to whom is it too much? And to whom is it too much of something too soon, right? Who is the one who has to be slowly, taught how to engage with kind of this difference? So we see that there are a lot of ways in which we need to unpack some of the assumptions that shape these conversations, the reporting around what is happening in the industry, and the way in which, even kind of in the intellectual academic way, we think about diversity. So I want to call your attention to some of these kind of conversations that have been happening in the field across multicultural studies, critical race studies, industry studies, Asian American and South Asian American studies, and also highlight that these are some of the ideas that I'm in conversation with in my work. And the first one, of course, here, as I mentioned here, is the idea of diversity as outcome. And Herman Gray, in his 2016 article, Precarious Diversity, actually points to the fact that there has been both in the kind of epistemologies of thinking about diversity, the ways in which we think we understand what diversity is, the way we think we can capture it through our analysis, and the way in which we can predict whether diversity has happened or not, still is caught up in the limitations of the frame itself. So how diversity essentially is displacing the question of race. So diversity becomes a stand-in for something else, and how questions of inequality are being thought of through outcomes and through kind of quantifying the outcomes. But he also kind of, cautions us about not getting too sedimented into this tracking diversity as a way to figure out whether we have gained ground or we have lost ground or maintained ground, but to actually think about diversity in a very precarious way, that the notion of diversity, the reasons it emerges in the US in the late 90s in a particular industrial social context, and the ways in which it kind of goes up and down depending on what the context is, reveals the precariousness of that concept. So we don't have to be like wedded to it, and we certainly don't need to look for it for kind of some sort of racial liberation. The second notion comes from multicultural studies, and of course South Asian American studies as well. And Shohat and Stam's notion of multiculturalism as a way to think about decentering Eurocentrism. But then, as other scholars, South Asian American scholars like Shilpa Dave and Shalini Shankar have argued, this decentering of Eurocentrism also creates new imaginaries for thinking about South Asian Americanness, identity, location, and politics, even as they constantly have to ward off the kind of powerful ways in which they are produced as stereotypes. So even in this kind of reimagining, there is a strong legacy of thinking of them through stereotypes. As I showed in the images earlier, South Asian Americans as super consumers is one good example of thinking about how older legacies are being reframed and very much active in the current climate. So super consumers as a reworking of model minoritiness. And then Sarah Ahmed and Stuart Hall's notions about thinking about why is diversity, why does it have appeal? Like, what is the reason it has cultural currency? And can it, as Sarah Ahmed argues, are we as in people who are invested in this, doing diversity? And if we are, in whose interests? Is it possible that the appeal of diversity is that it actually conceals inequalities, but that it also offers institutional rewards for those who are willing to produce more and more knowledge around it? So they're really kind of asking us to think about the power-knowledge nexus, in what kinds of agendas become central to these conversations. And the last comment here by Hall is really something that I think shapes my entire presentation here, is that if we are thinking about diversity from the industry perspective as ultimately leading to a transference of power, is it being primarily reduced to the terrain of representation? So that having more images is one way to show that we have arrived at diversity. All right, so I want to look through 3 examples. Let me look at the clock here fairly quickly and use them as illustrations to think about the different ways in which we should think about unpacking diversity and interrogating diversity practices. And through all of my examples, what I really want to do is go beyond the question of representation in terms of what is there in the content and look at the question of race and its relationship to diversity more broadly. So the first one is the trailer for The Problem with Apu.
I hate Apu.
Hate Apu.
And because of that, I dislike The Simpsons.
The whole series.
Yeah.
I love The Simpsons because...
You hate yourself.
My name is Hari Kondabolu. I've had a great career filled with laughter, critical acclaim. I should be completely happy, but there's still one man who haunts me, Apu Nahasapima Pedalon.
Please pay for your purchases and get out and come again.
How many of you had to deal with being called Apu or that being referenced?
The Simpsons, stereotypes, all races. The problem is we didn't have any other representation. Cabby, 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 deli, deli, deli. Doctor.
You know that a white guy does the voice?
A white guy doing an impression of a white guy making fun of my father.
How do you feel about that?
Oh, I'm making a movie about how much I dislike it.
Right away, they were like, can you do an Indian voice and how offensive can you make it? I would immediately begun to talk this way. I was like, it's not tremendously accurate. It's a little stereotype. Like, nah, it's all right.
They want the accent to sound like this and they want your tongue to be really pulled back.
So Patayang King was going into a room and having to do that exact thing in front of people like a monkey.
There are accents that, by their nature, to white Americans sound funny, period.
It's funny because it's racist. Does Apu count as a minstrel since it's brown paint, a white guy's voice?
He has all the qualifications.
Remember, please, children, that in life, there is nothing that is not so disgusting that it cannot be sold on a heated roller at a nearly criminal markup.
Now, I realize some of you think I'm some annoying PC social justice warrior that's very sensitive, and you're probably thinking, come on, Snowflake, let it go. Well, I have let it go for 28 years.
So again, there's a lot I can say about this documentary. I have published one piece on it and I'm working on the second piece on this. So I'm going to be brief in the comments, and in Q&A, we can talk a little more about it. But one of the main things, and so the citation here is the piece that came out just a couple of months ago. The question I want to ask when we see a documentary like this is not to restrict ourselves to looking at, Hari Kondabolu made this documentary. It's highlighting that Apu is a stereotype. This is a good expression of the way in which South Asian Americans and Indian Americans are being included into the media industry landscape and making texts, and they're doing storytelling. And now that's certainly true, right? He made a documentary, he told his story. But my question here is, instead of asking that, what if we ask, what happens when Kondabolu wants to engage the issue of Indian accent? And I'm here citing Shilpa Dave, who's written about it, whose concept of brown voice is very critical here. So what happens when Kondabolu wants to engage this question of accent seriously? And what when he doesn't want to just talk about the reception of Apu among South Asian Americans, which he does, but he also wants to go back to the site of production and interrogate the context of Apu's production. So here, he doesn't just want to be included in the industry's diversity, not just have a seat at the table, but really question the organization around the table. So he wants to participate actively in framing the conversation, not just responding to the questions. And so instead of looking at the image, the representation, and the finished product, what happens when we look at the production-related challenges for this documentary? We look at the erasures and the microaggressions in the interpersonal industry interactions. Again, there's a lot, and I'm kind of condensing it. And what we see here, we see in the production-related challenges that Kondabolu has, we recognize the racial hierarchies that shape the media industries, and we see the efforts and the struggle over the regulation of minority voices. So for one, The Simpsons is an iconic mainstream show, iconic white mainstream show. And it's been on since 1989. It has several producers who are attached to it. And so Kondabolu, when he tried to contact them to ask them whether they would be a part of this documentary, he mentions in the documentary, it is mentioned in interviews, that most of them did not reply. And most of them, of course, and all of them declined. So that is an important detail, an important practice. We cannot lay it by the side and just think about what he created, but what he had to go through in trying to get a white accountability that he wanted in the show. Hank Azaria takes a month to respond. He negotiates the terms by which he would agree to be a part of the documentary, and then eventually declines. And the reason he declines is he says, I cannot control how I'm represented, and so I don't want to be at the mercy of your edits. And so Kondabolu puts that last bit in the documentary and points out the irony of the fact that Hank Azaria, a white actor playing a brown character in brown voice, like brown face, is essentially saying, I don't want that somebody else is in charge of my representation because I'm worried about it. When he has been enacting an Indian immigrant voice with a kind of stereotypical racist Indian accent for so many years. And finally, Dana Gould, who is the only producer who agrees to be on camera, couple of things around him. One is he's patient, he listens to Kondabolu's critique, but essentially he brushes them off. And then he, of course, says, there are accents by their very nature, which are funny. So he's normalizing Indian American accents or Indian accents as quintessentially funny to white Americans. And two interesting things about it is that in the press that emerged around this, there was kind of a discussion about how Dana Gould was, so it was so good of Dana Gould to show up for the interview, the one. And even Hari Kondabolu had to acknowledge in one of the interviews that he was so grateful that Dana Gould became part of his documentary. He wanted to talk to him about racism, and Dana Gould did not. He showed up to say it's not racist. And Dana Gould gets applauded for denying Hari Kondabolu's assertion that Apu is racist. But still, Dana Gould is worthy of appreciation in the press for just having showing up, right? So I think these kinds of power relations that are imbricated in these kind of subtle details around a text tell us a lot more about the evolving power dynamics. For instance, the fact that the documentary had to edit out the terms of the negotiation with Azaria. And eventually those details came out when Kondabolu was interviewed by the press later on. The Simpsons team tries to control the narrative by their silence, so they refuse to make a comment. And when Hank Azaria is kind of almost, accosted at the airport by a TMZ reporter who wants to ask him, do you have something to say about this documentary? Azaria skips mentioning Kondabolu's name. And so we can think of it as a form of microaggression, right? And he says, oh, the documentary had interesting things to say. We need to think about it. And what is not being said here is that since the early 90s, so Apu premiered in 1889 or 90 in episode 8 of season 1. And there have been discussions, albeit in the immigrant press, about how Apu is very racist. And Azaria has actually been contacted. He's given interviews to the Indian American press through the 90s, where he's tried to kind of address this question. So it's not that he's unaware of it, but he produces this as a new knowledge that Kondabolu has created. And of course, the show creator, Groening, essentially says, this is a time in our culture when people love to pretend that they're offended by everything. And Simpsons did respond to the show, but it is what people have said is a kind of a post-racial response, essentially saying, oh, it's all this PC culture where suddenly you have to look at texts that were not racist in the past that have now become racist. And these kinds of assertions tell us that for South Asian Americans and Indian Americans and others who cared about these questions, it was racist even in 1989, right? So the question is, for whom does it become racist now? And then finally, I think the fact that Kondabolu took to social media and kind of fostered a conversation around the hollowness of the industry's claim about diversity is very important, because it reminds us that we cannot restrict the storytelling about race to what appears in front of the camera. I want to look quickly at the second example.
Here he is. We need your help. We're trying to become citizens.
You seem pretty American to me.
I thought I was. Now I gotta take like some dumb history test just so I don't get sent back to Moldova.
Where is Moldova?
I don't know, man. What do I look like, a book? That's Griselda. She's Dominican. That's Hakeem. He's a nerd from Ethiopia. Malin and Jun Ho. They're rich as hell, but they won't actually say where they're from.
Our dad lives in international waters.
Is this the man who will help? Was a great idea, brother.
We're not brothers. You use the word disco as a verb.
We want to disco. Let's go disco right now.
We need a teacher.
I'm gonna go ahead and say no.
We were gonna hire you for the whole week.
That's like 15,000 bucks.
My God, do you think that's a lot of money?
Griselda, you're up.
Yep. I thought you worked at FedEx.
I do. At night, I work here.
Oh, 2 jobs.
Kind of. In the morning, I deliver newspapers. Then I go over to the Genius Bar and I fix a couple of iPhones for a few hours. Then FedEx. Let me get your refund.
In school, our dad would have one conversation with our teacher, and we'd get all A's.
He bribed them? I wouldn't call getting your family back a bribe, but sure.
It's clear your dad is a legit supervillain.
What are you talking about?
I told you, I'm more of a science guy.
Be less boring.
Back home, I was a cardiothoracic surgeon, but I love America. I want to be a part of it.
Awesome, man. Thanks for the ride.
You owe me $27.50.
Oh.
What does this place have to do with us?
Look at those guys out there. You got immigrants from everywhere.
It's been inspiring just being here. Well, back to work.
Sarah! Sarah here!
Can anybody tell me who Benjamin Franklin was?
He's the guy on the 100. Those are my favorites.
Yes, but that's not exactly what I'm looking for.
Is he Hamilton from Hamilton?
That's Hamilton.
You can't just let a bunch of strangers into my house.
It would only be illegal if we were soldiers and the government was forcing you to house us. That's the Third Amendment. Boom.
Jun Ho, you learned something.
I'm amazing.
So here with this show again, I'm interested in the what happened to the show after it premiered in fall 2019. Just a quick details about it. Cal Penn, who is a very kind of high-profile, visible Indian American, is the star, the co-writer, and the co-producer of this show. And a lot of the press before the show was released was around the immigrant-centric show and the fact that the theme, of course, is immigration in the context of, the Trump administration, and that all the writers were either immigrants or children of immigrants. And the cast included an ensemble cast of 7 characters who played immigrants, and 5 of the actors who played the immigrants were actually immigrant. So there was a lot of press devoted to the thoughtful or deliberate way in which casting was done. And Cal Penn himself has noted that this is a non-partisan, non-political show for broadcast television. And he pointed out that if he wanted to make it political, he would have gone to a different either a streaming service or an edgier network. What is interesting about this show is that although NBC approves one season and kind of asks for 10 episodes and asks them to do the 11th one in production, after 4 episodes. So the first episode aired September 26th, 2019. And on October 15th, when the 3rd episode had aired, NBC announces that the episode that is going to air on October 17th, which is the 4th episode, is going to be the last one on broadcast television. And they replace the time slot, which is 9:30 p.m. on Thursday, with the 11th season of Will and Grace. And episodes 5 to 11 of this show were available on digital platforms. And finally, after the last airing on December 5th, the show is canceled. Now, the industry discourse, what is interesting to me here is that the industry discourse around I'm sorry, I'm just working with my slides here. The industry discourse before the season premiere foregrounded the diversity factor. So there was a lot of emphasis on the fact that this is going to be a very diverse show. It's a very timely show, and it is, it's a good content show. And they downplayed the ratings factors. So as you can see in the quote here, there is Steve Kern, who's the VP of NBC Entertainment, says, "We are not looking at the first week ratings. We are looking at ratings over a period of time." But shortly after the episode airs and the ratings were not as they expected, we see a mix in the discourse. First, there is this positive kind of liberal response to the show's premise and the theme. And, for Variety calling it a feel-good show about the immigrant experience, Hollywood Reporter saying it's timely, it has a workable premise, And I think it was Hollywood Reporter who had said, well, Kal Penn's character's name is Shah. It's kind of very specific as a last name, but it's not really funny. And that was an odd comment. But the bulk of the coverage actually pivots to the show's underperformance in broadcast ratings and its implications for NBC's Thursday night lineup, but more broadly, its implications for Universal Television and NBC's goals of having broadcast shows that would double up as digital hits and be a streaming blockbuster. So for me, that is a very interesting thing, that the way in which diversity becomes central to the, before the show airs, and shortly after the show airs, diversity is no longer good for business. So diversity is good for business to pitch and to start, but the moment, and this is after 3 episodes, right? They didn't wait longer than 3 episodes to make some calculations about it. Excuse me. With the writer-producer team, 2 other things happen. We see that Kal Penn and Matt Murray constantly kind of highlight in that interim period between like October and November, with the hopes that they can shop for a new network or a streaming system, a delivery service for this show. And they also kind of highlight that although the show didn't do well with broadcast audiences, it did very well with younger audiences and digital audiences. And NBC themselves point out that the audiences who watched it on the broadcast schedule were more wealthy and more educated. So there's a certain kind of investment in what kinds of audiences are watching it. And Penn and Murray tried to really extend that conversation about the young and the digital, right? Making the point that there is a place for this show. And just around the same time, the Television Academy does a panel on immigration and television and does not include this show. And so Kal Penn kind of calls it out and says, for the only show that is currently in town that has this majority immigrant cast and writers, it's kind of odd that you didn't think of including us. So here, what is interesting for me is the industrial logics framing diversity. So we see that when the discourse around the show before it appears really registers this multicultural diversity and immigrant cultures as a feature of the now. So when people say, oh, an immigrant show is timely, it's almost again suggesting that this is a feature of the now. It is a new thing. And then, it's kind of a very racial capitalist logic. It's also very ahistorical. But why it is beneficial is because it helps shore up the idea that the industry's practices are emerging and meeting needs as they emerge. So the notion of the immigrant-centric content as an emergent need is very fertile for the industry to kind of use to kind of place themselves in this position of we are constantly meeting the demand that is kind of emerging. Also interesting here for me is Penn's very complicated position. Right? He's trying to appease NBC and Universal Television, and he's trying to appease to the broadcast, imagined broadcast audience. And so we see in, if you go back through, his tweets, like in the American flag, heart, and saying, this is the most diverse show, it has heartwarming patriotic episodes, etc. He's really trying very hard to kind of fit in. And then he's also forced to speak out when he feels that him performing diversity, to use Sarah Ahmed's term, is not giving him the institutional rewards that he had hoped. And so we see Kal Penn is also kind of trapped within it, but more broadly, the industry discourse itself is trapping the idea of diversity within the context of returns on investments. And we have to be very careful about not falling into the same trap ourselves if we want to really understand it and understand the power of these discourses. And so here, diversity is marketed as an empirically stable product with predictable institutional rewards. And the moment it looks like Sunnyside is not going to do that, it is no longer quote unquote diverse enough. It needs to fall off the kind of chopping block. Okay, all right, I'm going to show you another clip very briefly. I think I have the time for it. Can you see my variety clip? Okay.
So when I did Crazy Rich Asians and they were looking for actors, it's crazy how many people said, well, there are no Asian actors. And what they really meant is like, oh, there aren't a lot of Asian American actors who are represented by the top 3 agencies and have a huge resume. Yes. Why do you think they're not there? And so what John Chu, our director, did was he opened it up. He had people send in auditions via YouTube, and he watched every single one. He told them, like, with a pint of Halo Top. He's like at 3 a.m. He's watching every single one. And there is so much talent out there. So it's not that there are no great Asian actors. It's that a lot of the people who are in this industry aren't trying hard enough, or they lack the imagination. And I feel like you kind of did a similar thing with your Netflix show that you're doing now, is you kind of opened it up. And like, what was that experience like for you?
Yeah, well, first of all, I loved Crazy Rich Asians, and you could really tell that there had been so much time and effort to finding people from all over the world to play the parts. And I love that it wasn't just, you know, you grow up seeing like the 3 Asian actors that you've seen in movies before. It felt so researched, which I love. So for my new show on Netflix called Never Have I Ever, it's about a 15-year-old Indian American girl. And there's all these like very cultural specific things in it. She's Indian American, but her mother is Indian. And she's from South India, which is a different accent than if you're from North India. And her cousin is also South Indian, but has been in the country for less time. So there's all these things that I really wanted to get right.
It's great specificity for character too.
Right, but then also poses these challenges for casting. And so we started casting, and when you cast for high school, a lot of times you
Sorry for the abrupt stopping of the video there, but you know, it's a longer clip, and in the interest of time, I just want to move on. But essentially what Mindy Kaling says is that, you know, when they tried to go with the usual routes of the Hollywood agencies, they got these South Asian American girls and women who seemed to all look the same. And she said, you know, I wanted some kind of fresh faces, but they all looked that they were, you know, coming out of some kind of manufactured image of what South Asian American or Indian Americanness looks like. And so she realized that she was trapped in the kind of the pipelines that were channeling this talent to her. And so what she ended up doing, which is what John Chu, Crazy Rich Asians director, did, is to use social media and post calls for auditions through, you know, Twitter, Facebook, all the social media networks, even WhatsApp. And, you know, I remember, and I keep telling this to my undergraduate students, when she posted the auditions, there was one for, you know, Maitre Ramakrishnan's mother's role, which was a middle-aged woman with a, you know, who has a history in India. And I seriously considered auditioning for it because I was like, this could be my big moment. And, you know, I just got too busy and I didn't audition for it. But it was interesting to see how I got it out through my WhatsApp networks, the call for audition. So they're really kind of trying to break free out of the systemic patterns that are there when you think about the top talent agencies. So for me, this interaction between Constance Wu and Mindy Kaling is a very, very interesting one, again, because when we're trying to think about the question of race and diversity in the context of industry, there's a lot to unpack and interrogate in these kinds of assemblages around the text, which we have kind of, you know, often seen as the place to understand whether diversity is happening or not, whether it has arrived or not. What is the outcome of diversity? Do we have more South Asian Americans on screen? Are they getting awards? Are they getting rehired, or are they getting shows, etc.? But when we also look at the other conversations that are going on around it, I think they can tell us a lot about, again, the tensions and the power relations that are shaping and the struggle that is going on. So here, the fact that they met in the context of Variety, which, like Hollywood Reporter, has been doing these kinds of roundtables and these conversations. So this was Actors Studio, actors talking with actors. So they use this platform, which is Variety doing this kind of performative allyship, right, with the diversity platform, but they use it to mount a critique of the top talent agencies. And as you can see in the image on the right, there is a certain way talent is kind of inherently coded as quintessentially white, and then diversity added as an extra dimension of, you know, we want to go look and find the talent that is out there. That includes non-white communities. But they also reveal through their social media usage and kind of call for auditions that they're trying to circumvent Hollywood's white-centric ideologies of what even a talented South Asian American is, because they don't want the Hollywood-produced South Asian American girls who were showing up for the audition. So it's an interesting conversation here that is going on between how do we have structural change, what do we do in the context of performative allyship, how do we critique from within, because they're both in the industry trying to call attention to it. So these are the last 2 points I want to make. Is my goal here with using these 3 examples is to really kind of expand our conversations around diversity, both intellectually, so kind of really kind of unpack what it means and what it's actually displacing, which is kind of race and racism and racial privilege and hierarchies, and to think about critical ways in which to think about it. So we know that within the industry, there are people who are trying to, have practices, are trying to call for policies and trying to break the barriers from within it. But as researchers and as scholars, I think we can contribute by offering a historical perspective on contemporary trends. So for example, when people talk about diverse shows or channels getting canceled, there is a long history of diverse shows being approved and being canceled. And this is not just a trend that we see in the media industry. We know more broadly with the notion of diversity and inclusion, a lot of people of color or shows of color are made visible when they enter a landscape, but we often don't hear when they exit it, right? So there's a kind of a performance of being inclusive, but it is not something that is maintained. It is quickly kind of dismantled. We also see the financial viability argument or unviable argument, which is we really want to be diverse, but it's not really viable right now. And we know there's tons of research that tries to connect that, people want diverse shows, there are box office returns, but at the same time, you also see a kind of competing logic, which says that it can be unviable. And so we are looking for exceptional minorities. We are looking for exceptional diverse shows, which again, from the Asian American perspective, is something that happens. And I would broadly critical race perspective is something that happens even with individuals, right? You cannot have the privilege of mediocrity. You have to be an exceptional, racially different body within this kind of white imaginary. And so kind of really centering and focusing how notions of diversity are actually a creation of the kind of whiteness of the industry, rather than the fertile discussion about systemic inequalities and systemic racism that comes from the people who are experiencing it and are asking for change. And so to think about how diversity has kind of become a sort of industry standard and how it's being operationalized. But at the same time, I think, again, recalling Gray's work, among others, and Hall's work too, how diversity is a floating signifier. So in other words, diversity does not mean the same thing that it meant in the 60s. Multiculturalism does not mean the same thing that it meant in the 60s, from where it comes. And the notion of Asian Americans as model minorities in 2020 is something distinct from how Asian Americans as model minority emerged in the 1960s. So to have a kind of flexible approach around all of these things. And the very last point I want to make, and this is the broader kind of stepping back from the South Asian example and just thinking about doing media industry studies or production studies and thinking about centering race, because race, as Omi and Minot have argued, is a kind of organizing principle here. Although it intersects with other things, it is a kind of a master category, so to speak. So the question here I want to leave you with questions is what happens when explicitly directed attention is played to specific media examples instead of industry-approved pathways to performing diversity. So for instance, instead of looking at the problem of Appu as the documentary itself, what happens when we look around at the controversy around it, and we look at Kondabulu's extra-textual kind of discussion of the challenges that he faced? What happens if we imagine South Asian American participation in the industries as more complex and flexible and not linked to numerical and data-driven frames of are they losing ground, or are they maintaining ground, or are they making new ground? Can we find an alternative way to imagine what South Asian American participation looks like? And what, instead of the neoliberal marking of diversity, we engage with race and racism in our discussion of the industry? And lastly, what if we recognize that even our methodologies for studying industries have emerged out of a neoliberal academy, which has ties to neoliberal capitalism? And so can we begin to acknowledge complicity and privilege in our research methodologies around the object of our research, which is media industries. And so really think about the fact that if the object and if the angle, the lens with which we engage with industries is different, we have to recognize why we've had certain older methodologies and whose interests it really elevates or privileges. So it's really kind of, the kind of a self-reflexive way in which we recognize how race actually shapes not just the media industry, but how we actually study it and who studies it as well. So that is my last comment for the conversation here. I am looking forward to your questions. And I get to see all your faces now.
Thank you, Mary. I really enjoy this talk. It's so rich, so thought-provoking. It's really point out many problems and the issues, as well as directions, how the industry should handle diversity much better. And I also want to shout out to quite a few of our alums. Thank you for joining us. And we have 4 more talks down the road. And I hope to see your faces again. Now, let's open the floor to questions. Mary?
Sure, thank you. Thank you for this talk, Madhavi. It's wonderful to see how your study is coming together, and it's really going to be a useful book for all of us. I look forward to using it. My question has to do with, in studying the media industries, like, as I'm guessing that maybe you've sometimes encountered something I've encountered in doing research, that the studios and networks, they don't want bad press. They don't want to air their mistakes, or even sometimes to show like that they are attempting in some ways awkwardly to sometimes to better serve like the diversity of audiences, and doing focus groups and things that are not publicly shared. There's a lot of secrets and often a desire to not have us write about these topics. I'm wondering if you've encountered that, and if you have strategies that have been helpful for gathering information in these areas where they really don't want us to shine a light.
Well, in the context of the current work, I have not yet encountered that issue, also because I have not done a lot of work in that specific arena where you actually are talking to industry people and asking them about these things. But I can say that from my previous work, where I tried to talk to internet entrepreneurs, I can say that's going to be very much the case. So for me, I think that is certainly, and I think, you're asking an academic version of, what Kondabolu was trying to experience in his documentary in some ways, right? The pushback, or the steering and the regulation of the voice and what is accessible or not. And I think for me, I think that the question is more about not seeing our work as either for or against the industry, but rather for or against the question of equality. So in that sense, I then have to liberate myself from micro players in the industry, or also not have to bear the burden of walking them through their process of understanding all these implications, right? So that is quite honestly a labor that I do not want to do. And it's another form of racialized labor, right? Where I have to examine my own project from their point of view, and think about whether it is. And I know that was not necessarily what you were suggesting, but that you were asking me if there were any obstacles. So for me, I think I think the obstacles are what we write about then. So this is a kind of a historiography argument, right? So what do you do in the context of absence? What do you do in the context of erasure? And what do you do in the context of displacement? Then the displacement becomes the text. And it goes back to, for me, the question of representation, Hall's discussion about representation. Are we thinking solely in terms of what is produced, or the process of production, or the process of producing that image? So that the fact that I'm unable to find access to something, or I'm being gently asked to steer away from some questions, is the story, rather than what is presented. And the reason why I feel strongly about that is I think, although we're talking about race in the context of industry, scholars have been talking about race in the context of industry for decades. So it's not that this is a new topic at all. People have been talking about race in the context of industries. They've been talking about it not just in the context of image and representation. They have been talking in the context of markets, audiences, institutional, frameworks, and all of that. But the fact that we still are at a place where there is a long way to go for redressing the inequities tells us that we should feel a little more comfortable reorienting what we are studying, I think, because maybe we can shed light on that which does not want to be spoken about, and that can become the way we do our media studies, right? So I think I say obstacles are just primary sources.
Mm-hmm.
Thank you for your question. Thank you for your question.
Yeah, thank you.
Jen, may I just go ahead and call on people? Okay, thank you.
Thank you, Madhavi. This was amazing. And we need to get virtual coffee because there's a lot of overlap, strangely, with what you're doing and what I'm doing in terms of thinking about difference in the UFC. And I actually just went to a talk today that was women's sports is good for business. So they're picking up, I'm seeing this happening in sports media in a lot of places where this discourse of diversity is good for business is cropping up all over the place in various media industries. And one thing that I'm thinking about is that the use of the word diversity and how it is such a floating signifier, not only in terms of time, but there's ways that it's leveraged and used in different ways in different contexts, because I see what you're saying in terms of oftentimes it has to do with race, and that is sort of what it's standing in for. We're actually talking about race and we're using the word diversity. The other thing that I'm seeing though that's happening at the same time is that diversity becomes a catch-all and sort of a formula that can be used for a variety of different identities. So like sexuality or gender or something like that. And I'm curious if you're beginning to notice as you're going through this, the ways in which they're leveraged differently in different contexts or different moments. And if there are ways that, I don't know, that you might provide some sort of insights on why they might be different in different contexts or different moments in the same period of time when everybody's talking about this word diversity.
Do you mean in the media context or more broadly?
I mean in the media context or media industries context.
Okay, so I'm glad to hear of the overlaps, and I'm all for the virtual coffee. But to your question specifically, I think just to kind of comment on the first part of your question, which is diversity can be predominantly coded as racial, but it obviously also means other things. I think to recognize that, we have to look at the legal definitions of diversity and inclusion, right? So, think of university campuses and your DEI communities. So there is a kind of legal ways in which diversity includes different types of difference. But here again, I think it is Sarah Beneviser and Herman Gray in their discussion of media studies, and other scholars as well, have talked about difference as a technology of power, right? So to think about how difference gets activated differently in different contexts. And we can either choose to look at the surface level of what is the difference, what are the contours of that difference, what are the practices where difference is produced, and what is the outcome, which is certainly a very fine way to think about. So I am not necessarily arguing that we don't look at that level. What I'm arguing is that we have to look at the secondary level to see the interactions between the image and that which produces the image, or the, for example, South Asian American media celebrities who have made it big, who have, written shows or won Emmys and all of that, but the fact that they still operate within a kind of racialized economy, even though they have, they are not, you can kind of, very simplistically, if I may just put it, they are not one of the oppressed anymore because, they have control over their image and they have made it and they are telling new stories, et cetera, et cetera. So I think it is a kind of a dynamic between, in some cases, stepping back and looking at the patterns. So you can see the continuities and the persistence of certain trends. But then in the kind of strategic maneuvers of the industry that is very alert to the political implications and meanings associated with diversity, sometimes it helps to not look at that level, but go into specific examples and see the messiness around it. Because sometimes when you go very meta and you step back, it looks more or less like it's the same thing. There's some diversity, but we could do more. And so that kind of generalized way in which we think about gains and losing ground is not actually letting us think about the question of inequality, as Gray argues, in a very grounded way. And in all the ways in which we think about race. When we talk about race and racism in a, let's say, non-media context, but just like interpersonal level, we talk about affect, we talk about microaggressions, we talk about performing, a certain behavior to gain visibility. And we talk about how silence can sometimes be a political gesture by those who have been repeatedly marginalized. So when we begin to think and draw on those things that we are so used to in the cultural realm to the industrial realm, it requires a little bit of translation, right? It's a new vocabulary we are kind of drawing on. So I think I see with the racial element in the media industries, I see that in some instances, we, like Hall says, we see some representatives who have been accepted on the diversity platform and who have been rewarded, who are on the one hand trying to negotiate the relationship with the whiteness of the industry at large, but also kind of speak back to their specific communities and say, that is not our agenda. So they're kind of caught between the big structure of the industry and the kind of political aspirations of the communities they are representing. In other instances, I think we see a lot of South Asian Americans, for example, making some adjustments to how they want to present the South Asian American, right? And recognize and kind of taking this instrumentalist approach to how to present their image. So for me as a researcher, I'm not for or against any one group, right? So, because then you can caught up within elevating South Asian Americans as inherently politically having agency or their politics are right, and inherently kind of critiquing the industry for whatever it does. For me, it is more interesting to see if we break down the industry, not at the level of structures, but if we break it down at the level of practices, effects, and specific assemblage of meanings or a specific association of meanings that happens around specific examples, I think we can see the underlying patterns more clearly. I don't know, Jen, if I answered your question or I just wandered off into something else.
You gave me what I needed and so much more. So we'll talk more.
Thank you. I'm still kind of thinking through all of this. So it's almost like, intuitively, I feel this is where I have to go, but sometimes I myself falter in figuring out the different steps of how to build that argument. Yeah.
Thank you, Jane, for the question, and Marvin for this very elaborated answer. And I think that really shows the significance of this topic, because it's very much ongoing and going to shape the kind of text, the kind of media we consume, which eventually may become canon that further affect culture and media representations.
Yeah.
Any further questions? from our students.
I see Charles' hand up.
I see Charles raise a hand. Go ahead, Charles.
Great presentation, Madhavi. I learned a lot, and I really appreciate what you've done. I've always thought, well, I'm a textual guy, so I'm the guy looking at what's on the screen. But I've always thought in terms of the industry side, one of the key roles in what you were discussing is the role of the casting director who works for the production company or the director or whatever. And in terms of what they actually do, is they filter all the actors who apply and get it down to a manageable number. Usually it's around 40 or something. So there can be 2,000, actors who are interested, and it is the job of the casting director to get it down to that first group, and then probably consult with director, producer, whatever, and get it to a smaller group. And I always thought it'd be interesting to interview these casting directors, what is in their head when they're looking for these, roles that need to be filled. Have you come across anything about casting directors? And because that's a lot of power. I mean, you're the one that brings it down to that first short list.
Well, I mean, there is previous work on Asian Americans and the relationship between Asian American, actors and representation and casting directors, and Daryl Hamamoto's work, and the other works I kind of blanking on the names, but where they've actually interviewed casting directors. Mm-hmm. And they've done kind of qualitative ethnographic kind of discussions about it. And one of the things that has come historically from that work is that kind of a predictable lines, right? We are looking for somebody who's talented, which we know now is often a code, and that we are looking at somebody who fits the imagination of the writer. So it's writing and casting are kind of intimately connected, and that they recognize that there is talent out there, but they can only work with what there is. This is very similar for me to how Nielsen's has discussed why they took so long to do a report for Asian Americans. It took them until 2013. And one of the things they said is, we know Asian Americans have been in this country for a long time, and we know that they're buying things, but we haven't had the infrastructure, so to speak, to go and study them. So there is kind of an industrial logic and institutional logic that normalizes existing behavior as a kind of a natural outcome of the limitations, and some of the burden falls on the group that is kind of invisibilized, right? So that the talented Asian Americans are not showing up for the auditions, or that we have not made inroads into the community. And in the contemporary kind of landscape, I would kind of again turn to like somebody like Mindy Kaling, who has actually discussed her not so positive experiences with getting the kind of people that she is looking for, even when the writing is explicitly kind of giving as much of textual information about the kind of people. So I think there is a disjuncture, as Apadare would say, between kind of the cultural economies of these talent agencies and the cultural politics of the emergent group of writers, thinkers, showrunners in the kind of diverse camp. And so the fact that a lot of Asian American showrunners have said, we don't want this, we are just going to go and find an alternative space to look for this, it is kind of asking us to kind of reframe even those terms like talent, how to audition, so to speak, and who would fit in, right? So I think we are at a moment where it's not completely institutionalized, but they're really kind of trying to break free and create a kind of a new way to see whether they can loosen up. I don't think Mindy Kaling is saying that she will not use the talent agencies, but I think it is a way to signal using her cultural capital. And the fact that she said it during this varieties, actors on actors segment is to kind of point to the problems of the structural ordering that is kind of really hard, so that even if they're new imaginations, they're not able to be manifested, so to speak, because the pipes are old, right? So it's almost like there is a block. Using the metaphor of blocks, there is some block there that is not letting their kind of creative ideas emerge through the old channels, I think.
Yeah, I always thought it'd be nice if there was more diversity with casting directors, because they're just trying to fill a role for for the production, and they'll reach whatever decisions they make, however they make them, and it always occurred to me as a very powerful position that's almost invisible when we have these discussions. So I think, and the danger is you reach for the stereotype every time, because it worked before or something like that. But anyway, thank you so much.
Or the new stereotype, right? So the
right,
new,
the latest stereotype,
Right. And in that sense, the multicultural is the mainstream, is a stereotype, is a construct, is partly what I'm trying to say. I do want to quickly say, if somebody's hand is there, I can stop. But I am not necessarily arguing for that we don't track these kind of older economies of how things are being processed in the kind of pipelines, starting from top down till the text itself and what appears on screen. But I'm saying that I think it is very productive to actually, is an intellectual kind of exercise, to kind of say that how our old ways of thinking about all of these nodes of the industry themselves, the one we should be thinking of, not just the outcome of what's happening. So it's kind of, can we step back from the process itself to see how it functions within a larger context, which is like the global marketplace of diversity, the kind of racial capitalism that is shaping all of it, and the kind of commodification of ethnicity that we're seeing everywhere. So then do all of these things trigger different meanings that we cannot see if we are kind of quote unquote boxed in the frame already. So can we be a little, I forget the word, but provocative and kind of move away from the frame itself and see what we see in that process.
Very good. I really feel like this is a time to plan the advertisement for CME, and that's why the work industry analysis is so important, so that we can have a better understanding what got produced and what's not, who got what kind of representation. I see Melissa raised her hand. Yes, go ahead.
Hi, Madhavi. Hi.
Oh,
okay. Hello. Okay, really liked the presentation so much. It's very subtle. I want to ask a question which may sound like a segue from Charles's question. Is the question of nomination, or actually to be more specific, the problem of appellations, because half of these folks have had to change their names. Mindy Kaling, the casting director issue, so that it would sound as if you can pass for something, right? Or Carl Penn. I mean, these are folks who've had to change their names so that mainstream white people can pronounce their names. So this is something that I was actually sort of curious about, because South Asians are not the only ones, because I do know that the Iranians have had to change their names as well, because we are actually talking about anything that is multi-syllabic, okay, which may have happened at Ellis Island with the Jewish names, but it looks like this is something that we've actually adopted, right? Mindy Kaling's name is Choki Lingam. So it's like a whole different name that, she's had to sort of drop off. So I was wondering if you could, you don't even have to say anything, but it's sort of like, your name is branded on you, right? So even if you have diversity, that you have to constantly pass so as to fit it, even as you are trying to break in, it's a complicated. Right. And on a totally naughty note, I have to say, my favorite person right now on none of these shows, but is that CNN reporter Manu, who I think is the most amazing actor around. We're actually talking about end of network television. Thankfully, that's over, that period. But now we're actually dealing with CNN's reporters, and that's where you're going to find Indians, or you're going to find, meaning there's that too, right? Or Indian Americans, I should say. Yeah.
Right. Okay. So very quick answer. Thank you. Very quick answer to your first comment about the changing of names. I'm also reminded of that it's a kind of a global concern. Like I know, Bengali names, Bhattacharya becomes Banerjee, et cetera, et cetera. So yeah, there is a longer kind of neo-colonial, neo-imperial legacies. We can connect it to all of that. Certainly that is an interesting element to this conversation about how, when you think about the individual figures of these, these people in the industry, the choices they make, and who knows if they revert to certain names, are indicative of something else. So again, these become signs. We can read them as signs indicating something else. So the diversity factor really is a sign to talk about race. And so it's so in that sense to not, so Mindy Kaling's name from Chuck Collingham to Kaling is a kind of is expressive of the way in which she gained cultural capital, and then when she has sufficient cultural capital, how she's maneuvering that capital to make different kinds of choices in the place that is, while trying to not be expelled out of the system. So it's kind of, we can think of it like a hacking the system, I think can also be an interesting way to think about it. Lalita, does that quickly answer your comment? Yeah, but I hate to say this, but now that you are forcing me to think about whether Manu Raju has shortened his name, so I might get back to you by figuring out whether his name is something else. These are a comment here. I think I saw Jen's.
Yeah, it's from Penn about Marcus. Let's
Absolutely.
see the master question from our students. I see the faculty. Oh, Alisa raised her hand. Go ahead, Alisa.
Oh, well, I'd rather have a student ask a question than be the one to ask it if anyone, or I can ask it. I'm just curious because I'm excited to see the larger project that this is out of. If you could talk a little bit about sort of how this fits within your larger book project and what else kind of fits within that. Not to give you a big question at the end of the day.
Well, I could always give you a short answer. It fits seamlessly into everything else I'm doing. But the book, the Race and Ethnicity in Media Industries book, is really organized around, situating the question of multiculturalism as the new mainstream. And here, it's not just focused on Asian Americans, but a broader kind of discussion of how, from the civil rights movement onwards, from the 60s onwards, there was a really political, impetus to kind of think about America as a multicultural space. There were reasons for that. And so out of that, we begin to see how race begins to be produced in the industry in specific ways. Now, you can go back even further, right? I mean, but I'm kind of situating this conversation because it's tied to multiculturalism in the US context. And then, and how the notion of multiculturalism historically can be understood in light of the notion of public visions, right? PBS started in 1970, which is around the same time when these multicultural visions emerge. So there's an interesting way in which difference, racial difference, is coded as public visions. It becomes part of a multicultural society. And then we come to the present moment where it becomes commodified within in the market sense, as Jen was saying, it becomes a way to signal new markets. So you're even kind of performing diversity is a way to perform your entry into this kind of marketplace. And then you become an outcome. And then if you are able to be a kind of stable outcome, then you get rewarded, right? So that's where you can look at celebrities who get repeat shows or who get something or the other all the time. So that is the kind of beginning project, kind of connecting multiculturalism, and then looking at broader consumer industry discourses around the multicultural as the mainstream, and how the question of racial diversity, which is what race, which is what I care about, gets caught up in the question of ethnicity. So multiculturalism, as a lot of scholars who have written from around the world have written about this, talk about how multiculturalism displaces the question of race onto ethnicity and makes difference something that is manageable and can be made visible within the contours of a larger economy. In the US, we can think of it as a kind of a racial capitalism, the white industrial structure, etc. So, and then I kind of connect it to how in the industry language, when they say multicultural mainstream, they are thinking of three groups. And I'm using the industry terms for it. They say African American, Hispanic, and Asian American, right? And then they have something called others, which is like your miscellaneous files on your computer, like everything goes. And Native Americans and indigenous, I don't think they use the word indigenous. Native Americans make an appearance there. So it's interesting to think about how for them, although ostensibly diversity is about race, the only three groups they're thinking of are these three. And so they're producing race, right? A lot of scholars are beginning to argue that here we have to recognize how these documents are producing race for us in the 21st century, so that we begin to see race as actually about multiculturalism, and multiculturalism as signaled by these three communities. It's also very, unfortunate, I think, where some of Nielsen's reports actually talk about things like Blacks continuing to be relevant, which is a very problematic slippage there about how they continue to be relevant. It's almost like they are kind of struggling to say that. But we see that Asian Americans and Hispanic communities are connected to the digital more often. So we see that. And then I have chapters on Asian Americans, African Americans, and Hispanic Americans. And when I say, again, I'm using their own logic to unpack how they're framing it. And then towards the end of the book, I'm really kind of arguing that diversity is displacing race, and our methodologies have to resist that urge, and we have to center race and all questions of racial hierarchy, even racism, within our conversation about the industry, if we really want to settle some questions, and if we really want to make some kind of inroads in the bigger picture, which is transference of power, reduction and removal of systemic inequities, right? And not just a kind of a spectacle of talking about image and visibility and inclusion. So inclusion is not the goal, participation is the goal. And what happens when people actually begin participating? Because that would be very disruptive. And when that is disruptive, like as Mary was saying, right, when she wants to ask a question, how are you policed or regulated or gently asked to return at another time with a different question? So that is the larger book. Thank you for asking me, Alyssa, because I think it helps me think about it.
I appreciate that explanation. It's really helpful. And, I keep seeing your title and I'm like, what is the book? I want to know. So thank you.
Welcome. Thank you so much. Rita has her hand up, or a question has entered. Absolutely. Oh, that was, she raised her hand, or comment? I couldn't see. It was Jenna. So Jen's.
Josh, how are we doing in terms of time?
Yeah, so should we move to our graduate student discussion? Mm-hmm.
I think it's about time. I thank Madhavi again talk. And I think we all got some idea from her how we can advance our own work. And my big thanks to everyone who showed up. I know how many Zoom meetings you can have in a day these days. Thank you very much. And I look forward to seeing everyone in future global media industry speaker series talk. Thank you very much.